if an organization has strong norms of behavior, strong practices, that serves to minimize any of the negative pre-existing experiences or mindsets or biases that go into that culture. So that's the single best strategy a company can take to really ensure it's got a good workforce culture.
It's something that we've known since playing in the sandbox as children. Group dynamics are tricky. Working together opens space for conflict, and trying to get everyone on the same page and rowing in the same direction is difficult, to say the least. So much of our relationships, whether work or personal, are subjective, based on individual bias and perception. But is it possible that there's a data-driven approach to managing workplace culture? Today's guest is Janine Yancey, founder and CEO of MTrain. MTrain is a culture tech platform that provides information and advice to employees and analytics to employers to stop harassment, bias, and ethics problems. Janine is trying to use data to provide objective insights into one of the most subjective things, human behavior. It's a novel and incredible goal, and when you take a look at the data, you'll see why it's important. In the last couple of years, Janine and the researchers at MTrain have collected 2.5 million data points from over 40,000 employees at 125 companies. Here's what the data showed. That only about a third of employees feel that they can be their full, authentic self at work. That 38% of employees cite an us versus them culture, and cite that as the greatest source of conflict. And that 1 out of 5 employees indicate that those in authority often get away with bad behavior. So how do you use that data to create rules of engagement for the workplace? And how do you make sure those rules don't suffocate the company culture, but instead empower it? Today, Janine joins us to talk about these stats, what they mean in context, and how business leaders can act on them. Plus, she shares some of the stories about what this looks like for businesses who decide to take action. Enjoy.
This season of Hidden in Plain Sight is brought to you exclusively by our friends at Splunk, the Data to Everything platform. Splunk helps organizations worldwide turn data into doing. It's time for data to be more than a record of what happened. It's time to make things happen. Learn more at Splunk.com or by clicking the link in our show notes.
Janine, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
It's my pleasure, and I'm excited to dive into some culture topics today. But before we get into all of that, I wanted to ask you, where are you calling in from today?
So today I'm in Sacramento, California.
Very cool. Is that too far away from where MTrain offices are, or are you a remote team? How's that set up?
We're headquartered in San Francisco, but me and a handful of us live in Sacramento. So we actually have 2 offices.
I love it. And when you were starting out at founding MTrain, what was that genesis like? And was there an aha moment, or was it a series of aha moments? What led you there?
Yeah, so my background is as a lawyer and a labor and employment lawyer. So helping companies, respond to and manage different workforce issues. And as part of that, I was doing a lot of training, live training. And at some point along the way, I just kept on seeing a need to have really good guidance in real time to employees and to managers. And that's really kind of what prompted me to start MTrain and to stop practicing law, which I finally did in 2006.
When you were working in law, was it a situation where you just kept running into, similar scenario after similar scenario, and, the pattern matching and recognition started to kick in, and you said, okay, there has to be a better way to do this? Or was it just, seeing people in so much pain out there? What were some of the inspirations for starting MTrain?
Yeah, so I think you hit on some of it, Chad. So I mean, certainly when you're any kind of HR professional or in-house lawyer or an outside employment lawyer, you do see the same situations over and over again, to the point where a domain expert can typically kind of call it. So that was certainly part of it. But the other part of it was seeing that there's just not a lot of information flowing back and forth between the business leaders and people in the trenches. So you've got your HR leaders and your in-house counsel who are trying to guide and trying to provide advice to folks. But they're kind of sitting in an ivory tower often. And then you have your whole workforce, and things are happening in real time in the moment. And it's not operationalized in a way where they're reaching out and getting advice on how best to navigate situations. And, even 15 years ago, I could see that there was a need for a easy, trusted channel so that people can access, some amount of guidance in real time to better help them navigate what we call the tricky culture issues.
Sure. And I think the tricky culture issues are something that we all need help with. There's bias that's implicit, it's explicit. Each of us comes from an entirely different background and upbringing. When you started to become aware of these issues, is there a specific story or were there a series of incidents where you said, okay, there has to be a better way? I'm curious about how you got really drawn to this.
Yeah, I think it was seeing a lot of situations that I was called on to defend because I was typically representing employers, harassment and bias situations where I was defending people that by and large were decent people that were not intending to cause offense or problems, but that just were not understanding another person's perspective or how things played out. Um, and certainly as a woman in business, I certainly encountered my own fair amount of kind of difficult situations, and I just think that there's not a whole lot of information flow back and forth between people that are making all the business decisions and those that have to, be the recipient of those decisions.
Sure. And your background's very interesting. And one of the things that you bring to the table here is a strong interest in behavioral science. So were there a set of books? Were there a set of academic studies? Or what are your interests there? And how have you kind of built that into the culture at MTrain and what you're doing?
Yeah, so I just started reading tons of books, behavioral economics, behavioral science, and I think for me, my focus was always very practical. So I think where I was different than a lot of other lawyers is I was just looking at the outcomes and what situations led to bad outcomes. And if you look at it from that frame, that lens, then instead of looking at it just from a legal perspective, what are the legal elements and have we satisfied those? And does that turn into some legal violation? So put all that aside and instead start looking at it from the behavioral focus. And what are the behavioral dynamics, if you will, that when they're at heightened levels and they're unaddressed, they lead to bad outcomes. And that's really kind of started where I started shifting and led us to take a very different approach.
Yeah, and I think that a different approach and unique approaches and more approaches is something that's really needed here. There are many different stats that you have cited on your site, and there's a cultural report I'm looking at here. I think one of the ones that's the most interesting is about only 32% of employees feel like they can be their authentic self at work. Could you unpack that a little bit for us and describe it?
Yeah. So let me back up if you don't mind, Chad, a little bit, because I think where
Sure.
so stemming from this idea that we could look at behavioral dynamics. What we did in the area of respect, for example, was to say, okay, when you have, let's say, the opposite of respect is harassment, disrespect, and you map it back to kind of the predictive behaviors that are going to cause a bad outcome. We identified six different predictive behaviors, and those were in group, out group dynamics, our unconscious bias, our social intelligence, pre-existing mindsets, organizational norms and practices, and power disparity. So we asked a series of questions, all relating to one of those predictive behaviors, if you will, or predictive dynamics. So looping back to your question on people who don't feel like they can be their authentic self, we understood that your ability to feel like your authentic self is part of feeling like you're included and you're accepted in the workplace culture and that you're valued. And so we led people through some experiences and through content and through workplace scenes and asked them, basically if they feel like they are included and if they feel like they're comfortable being authentic. And 2.5 million employee responses later, and we understood that over 30% of respondents felt like they could not be their authentic self, which that goes into how vulnerable your workforce is at any given moment.
And the study that you're talking about here is when you analyzed about 2.5 million data points from 40,000 employees at roughly 125 different companies. When you were picking out those companies and thinking about constructing this group and this sample, how did you go about that? And I'm curious to know kind of the why behind that and maybe some of your most interesting insights from doing it.
All of the survey questions or kind of employee sentiment questions are introduced after we're explaining topics and showing people workplace scenes so that we all have a shared understanding of what we're talking about. Because the problem when you just use a term like harassment or bias is we might all be using the same term, but we have different, very different ideas of what that might mean. So we take people through content and show them video scenes, and then we ask them to weigh in about their personal experiences within their workplace. That's basically the format of that. And through that, we're able to gather, all this really rich data. In addition to the stat that you referenced about people who didn't feel like they could be their authentic self, another really interesting learning from this culture report was that one of the predictive behaviors that we look at are what we call in-group, out-group dynamics. So it's basically, the cool clique versus the not cool clique, and dynamic within an organization. And the folks that are the in-group are closer to the power source. They're included. They feel like they can be their authentic self. The folks that are part of the out-group dynamics do not feel included, are more marginalized, and also don't feel like they can be their authentic self. If something bad happened to somebody from the out-group, they would, characterize it as less severe than it really was. So if it was the type of conduct that experts would rate as approaching harassment, the whole global community said, oh, that was just an awkward misstep. It was not a big deal. What the evidence was showing us is if you're part of an out group in an organization, you really are having a lesser experience in that organization. That was one really interesting finding. If an organization has strong norms of behavior, strong practices, established practices and norms of behavior, that serves to minimize any of the negative pre-existing experiences or mindsets or biases that go into that culture. So that's the single best kind of strategy a company can take to really ensure it's got a good workforce culture.
That's fascinating. And one of the other statistics I wanted to bring out and get your take on here is regards to social intelligence. And you found that about 42% of employees strongly agreed that they saw the skill of empathy from their colleagues. Could you kind of describe how you went about measuring that and what takeaways there might be for business leaders there?
Yeah, so that was another really interesting learning. So, from me and others on my team that are all former lawyers, litigators, what have you, we know that a lot of conflict comes from just miscommunication and not reading a room and not picking up on nonverbal cues. And so we cover those concepts in our online content, and we showed scenes of a person not basically picking up on nonverbal cues. And then we would take the opportunity to ask people, learners in the program, whether or not they work with people that have strong social intelligence skills after we, basically defined what we meant by that. It was interesting to see people's responses of we'd say strongly agree. We have, I work with people who have strong social intelligence skills, strongly agree to strongly disagree in a 5-point scale. And it was really interesting to see the different pockets within an organization, for example, where there were clearly some people that did not feel like they worked with people with strong social intelligence skills. And that just triggered, a natural conversation between us and that organizational stakeholder to pay attention to that, because that's where your vulnerability is going to be.
I think an interesting thing that's probably on the mind of many folks out there who are managing teams or an executive or a founder of a company is, okay, what is the first thing I can do today to kind of start to mitigate some of these risks and start to work on the communication, the empathy, the social intelligence? How do you usually go about getting leaders focused in the right direction, the low-hanging fruit?
The first step on the right path is just to get leaders very intentional about it. So I think it's common for leaders to delegate that to a head of talent or head of HR or head of people and not lean in themselves. But ultimately, it's the business executive's responsibility to set the tone and create the culture. And what we've learned is you need to be super intentional about it. That's really the first step. And then from there, it's a matter of building up your strong norms and practices and sharing and communicating. This is how we want people to show up here. And this is how we want people to interact with each other. As we get more and more data and get more employees leaning in and responding, it's so common for companies not to do that, not to be intentional about it.
What tips do you have for managers or leaders who are trying to become more intentional with this? And how can they start to, use the data to their advantage in these situations?
I mean, a good starting point would be for everyone, at least take a minute, look at our culture report, because we've created a framework to, basically tee up these different dynamics that happen in any team, in any workforce, and just, use it to think about it that way, pockets of behavior, if you will. And that then leads to really introducing these concepts, within your own team. And there's a variety of ways you can introduce them. You can introduce them through, a Zoom meeting, a virtual town hall, if you will, or some kind of a online media or content like what we offer. But, regardless, start introducing these concepts and figuring out a way. If you're not going to use, an application, figure out a way that you can get people to share candidly and authentically how they feel about those concepts and what they experience around those concepts in their everyday workplace, so that leaders and managers can start to understand and measure, these different kind of cultural touch points.
Sure. And when you're going about this and you have a large set of experiences now to draw from, I'm really curious to know about, how do we keep humor in the workplace, and how does humor stay something that can still be emergent and spontaneous and fun without worrying about how it'll be interpreted? Is there a way here? Have you seen any cultures that have successfully implemented this?
Oh, yeah, definitely. So, just because an organization is focused on making sure people feel comfortable and included and respected, I mean, that does not close the door to humor and having fun. So for example, at MTrain, and there's a lot of different ways to do this, but we introduce our workplace color spectrum, which allows people to color code behavior, not people, so people don't feel like they're judged. And if somebody starts getting a little too off color or a little bit too out of whack for the workplace, people say, "Oh, that's a little orange today," right? So it's an easy way to self-regulate. But you start from the idea that we're all human, we all make mistakes. A component of that is having fun and being, introducing humor to our teams and our workplace. So it's not mutually exclusive at all.
Definitely. Yeah, I love that. When you're thinking about building the culture at MTrain and you're reviewing data or looking at the latest behavioral science book or report, what is your learning routine like, and how do you go about implementing some of these latest studies into product improvements or cultural improvements? What's that process like for you?
Yeah, so for us, it's beautiful. Again, we start from the premise that we're all human, which means we're all flawed. As long as our intentions are good and we're trying to become wiser, that's what we need. And so we're practicing what we preach internally all the time. So we're using our solution internally. We're engaging in conversation and kind of resolving using the same tools, the same language, the same diagnostics that we're providing to our clients in the marketplace.
It seems like we're heading towards a future of better communication in the workplace. Is that what you see? And could you kind of paint us a picture of the future of work if communication continues to become better?
Yeah, I think we're headed in a really interesting direction. If I just take a moment to reflect back, we're coming from a place where people came to work. They kind of were not their authentic self normally, typically. They didn't really share their feedback with business leaders, and it was more of a one-way kind of message, more than as opposed to a feedback loop and a two-way conversation between management and employees. And that was less than ideal. And I think we're evolving to a situation where we are having an effective feedback loop. People are feeling more comfortable being candid. There are different channels for them to safely be candid so that management sees what's on the mind and the trending concerns of the employees within the workforce, so that they can be proactive and actually address concerns in a way that is a win-win. And I think that's where we're moving to.
Are there any examples or stories you have of a miscommunication where, both parties or the company culture viewed it as something that was malicious, but then it turned out to be just like a simple miscommunication that was fixed with new procedures, new standards, or maybe your all software? I would love to hear about the genesis of how this works in action.
Well, yeah. So let me just give you one maybe simple illustration. So we know of a client of ours where they had a national sales kickoff, week-long meeting, and this was back in January when people could actually gather together. And there were some conversations happening where people called each other out as orange. And I don't know the details of exactly what was said. But I do know that, as it was relayed to me, it was the type of conversation, the type of comments that could easily alienate and exclude certain demographics within the sales organization. And all of that was said without being malicious. It was, the sales leaders that made these comments were not intending to alienate or exclude members of their own organization. It was just, being thoughtless, basically, which that's human. We all do that. But because other members of the team realized that could show up to certain people on the team and feel hurtful, they called out the sales leader as, "Oh, okay, you're being kind of orange here," and that prompted a pretty candid, easy exchange. And it was just enough to avoid what could have been hurt feelings and feeling excluded.
When it comes to researchers in the fields or the best books you've read about behavioral science that have been like a shining city on the hill for yourself and for your pursuits at the company, what comes to mind?
A couple of folks for Harvard Business Review that I always read. I really think that as it relates to harassment and bias and ethics, I mean, there's one person at University of Michigan, David Meyer, I think is his name, and he did some interesting studies that I thought was that were really interesting. But there's really it's as it relates to these topics, I think it's still quite an emerging field.
Because the field is emerging so rapidly and it's changing in real time, is there an information gathering routine you have set up? And I'd love to hear about your day-to-day of information gathering. Are you talking with other business leaders? Are you focused primarily on your team? What's that breakdown look like?
Yeah, so I mean, we are reaching out to different academics. We just started doing that because I think we'd like to be part of a larger conversation that's happening. We, at MTrain, our plan is to release an annual report summarizing all the data that we've collected over the last, the prior 12 months, and have that add to the conversation, and really. It just evolve this conversation as we learn more. I think it'll become a much more interesting conversation.
Are there any specific studies or data points that you don't see that you would like to see more of? Are there any, studies that you would, like, in your dream world, want to conduct?
In a dream world, I would love to collaborate with, a few different research and teaching organizations and academic organizations, and have them look and see what we've done so far and the data that we've collected, and basically iterate on it and evolve it. Just what we've done in terms of kind of mapping back harassment and bias to a handful of predictive elements and dynamics. It seems like common sense, but no one else is doing it. And I think if we start to use that as a framework, and if it needs to be refined, that's great. But just so that all of us have a much more concrete understanding of which behaviors lead to which bad outcomes.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And being able to visualize this too is so helpful. I think the more that we can have training that is multimedia in nature, the easier it is to show people what we mean instead of, try to use words which are so prone to misinterpretation. So what's the state of multimedia training for these incidents? Because it seems like that's what we need to bridge the communication gap.
High quality content that engages people, and typically, reflecting scenes or situations that people are already thinking about and already talking about. So similar to like what you would do in a marketing system where, you're putting out content that is resonating with the community and with the audience, and get them to weigh in. And then as they're weighing in, that's providing you the insights and the data that, when aggregated over a large data set, like, millions of learners, it starts to give you some real business intelligence.
That's really exciting for leaders because I think so many of us want to get training rolled out across our teams. We want to make sure that everyone knows that the lines of communication are open and that, of course, we're all fallible and there can be miscommunications from time to time. Is there a cadence that you recommend that leadership, begins training like this or continues training? What type of cadence do you recommend?
We believe that the foundation, the pillars of a good, workplace culture start with your ethics, your respect, and your inclusion. Those three topics. So, to at least introduce some content, some programs on all three topics annually is important. And then added to that, beyond that, so, those are three broad topics. And within those topics, you have, more specific concepts. So, added to that, maybe touch upon some more specific concepts on a quarterly basis, I think would be, really helpful because you want to keep this conversation going. You want to basically operationalize it. And so that it becomes, not a one and done that you do once a year, but something that you're doing in some form or fashion every quarter. And it becomes part of the regular kind of dialogue of the company.
I love that. And Janine, what is a final thought experiment, challenge, or just a thought that you want to leave our listeners with today.
Thanks, Chad. I would say that, we've been, as a business community and employees, training on these issues for 20 plus years. But it's basically been a one-way message. And I think it's time to make this a two-way kind of dialogue and close the feedback loop. And you need to do that. Plus, you can't change what you don't measure. So we need to start measuring some of these predictive behaviors, predictive dynamics that occur in a workplace if we ever want to really change the status quo. So complete the feedback loop and start to measure these dynamics, and maybe will move us all forward.
Very inspiring. And Janine, it's important work you're doing. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us today. And would love to have you back at some point in the future. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Chad.
And to everyone listening, we'll see you next time.
I'm Sophia Bush, and you've been listening to Hidden in Plain Sight from mission.org. This podcast is sponsored by our friends at Splunk, the Data to Everything platform. In today's data-driven world, every company, big or small, new or old, is sitting on terabytes of unused, untapped, and unknown data. Splunk helps turn all that data into action. Using cutting-edge AI and machine learning, Splunk delivers real-time predictive insights that will help you on your mission to change the world. With solutions for IT, security, Internet of Things, and business operations, Splunk empowers people to make faster, better decisions and take action to get things done. It's time for our data to be more than a record of what happened. It's time to make things happen. Check it out at